Well, hello everyone. My name's Steve Bates. I'm the CEO of the UK Bioindustry Association, and welcome to this webinar on navigating the US biosecurity landscape, the impact for UK life sciences. This has been an emerging issue that members have brought to my attention, and I sort of thought it would be useful if we can make sure that people have got a good basic understanding of where we're at and have had the chance to think through what some of the implications may be. I'm very keen to turn this into an interactive discussion. So if you've got thoughts, comments, or chat, please do put things into the chat. I'm very keen to make this discursive. I think we're all learning about the implications. So welcome your perspectives and also where you want the conversation to go. In order to have this conversation, I thought a good way to do this would be to get somebody who really knows the scene in DC, who's been following the US BioSecure legislation, and that's Matt Weisel, who's joining us from America this afternoon. So Matt will be explaining a little bit of what that means. And then I'm also pleased that we're joined by Richard Mason, who's a CEO of Apollo Therapeutics, who's in a sense grappling with this issue from a UK life science company perspective. And I thought it would be useful to get Richard's perspective on how he's thinking about this, how we should think about this, and some of the questions that are going through his mind at the moment. So if that makes sense, I'm going to keep it very conversational, no slides, but hopefully lots of chat, and we'll see how it goes. Please make this interactive, and I'm going to need your help to get us to some more diversity on the panel through your questions and your input, because I'm afraid we've got three fellas on this one today. But with that as an introduction, Matt, perhaps I can ask you to join us. Look at that, looking fantastic in DC. Great to see you and great to have you with us. Maybe you can explain what your perspective is on this in the first instance. How do you get to be talking to people about the BioSecure Act?
Yeah, it's such a great question, Steve, and thanks so much for the time. It's great to be here with the UK Bioindustry Association and to deliver an update today on this. Of course, the biotech industry in the United States is hyper-focused on the BioSecure Act. In fact, many of you might recall a conversation we had about a year ago on the Inflation Reduction Act. This piece of legislation, which remains in very early nascent stages, frankly, in Congress, has garnered almost more conversation than the Inflation Reduction Act. So certainly top of mind for biotech companies, their investors, their leadership, and their research partners as well. And so I think one of the goals for today is to highlight some of the potential implications of the BioSecure Act. What is it, and why UK companies should care? Currently, Steve, just to give you a quick answer to your question, the BioSecure Act, it's a draft form of legislation. It's in Congress right now. There's actually two versions. There's a version in the US House of Representatives and a version in the US Senate. The version in the US Senate has moved a little bit through the process. There's a ways to go before the legislation could become finalized, perhaps by the end of this year. We do expect that it's moving. There's been a lot of sort of vocal discussion around the BioSecure Act here in Washington, D.C., much more so than we typically hear, which tells me that there's certainly some movement afoot. So I'm happy to dig into the details on this as we progress, but very pleased to be here today, Steve. Thanks so much.
So Matt, I'm going to come back to you straight away, but Richard, do you want to join us and explain to people a little bit of how you've been thinking about this in the first instance, Richard?
Great. Hi, Steve. Thanks very much for inviting me to join the panel session. It's a very interesting topic. It's one that, again, is very front of mind for us at Apollo. It's very much an area and a risk actually focused on for a number of years. We have an extensive global network of suppliers, and China risk is not new. This has been around for a number of years. We are customers of WuXi AppTec and WuXi Biologics, and I have to say we do rate them very highly. We think they're truly excellent at the services they provide. So that's a little bit of context, but we are very focused on this issue. We'll talk a little bit about supplier risk in general as a kind of concept, something that we probably all quite familiar with in recent times, both with Silicon Valley Bank, which is a very big example, and also recently we've had Catalent is being bought by Novo, which puts some certain capacity in the CDMO space at risk. So it's nothing new. It's something that I guess all companies focus on, and we certainly manage, and we'll talk a little bit how we do that. We manage a diversified network of suppliers, so we don't have concentrated supplier risk. But obviously, this is a new, the BIOSECURE Act is another thing that's come along, and I'm very interested in hearing what Matt's got to tell us about it today.
Thanks, Richard. So Matt, I think what I'm going to try and do is try and get us to put our feet on as much solid ground as we can in this, and I think some of this is helping us understand exactly where things are at. So it's called a BIOSECURE Act, and in the UK, an act is an act of Parliament that's gone through the process. The King signed it off, and it's the law. Whereas in fact, this is really just, although it's called the BIOSECURE Act, it's really a proposal, isn't it? It's a bill. There's still quite a long way to go, and you follow this much more closely than I do. But could you give us some sense as to what that journey might look like and what the timeframes might be?
Sure. Well, there's, a couple of potential, journeys, so to speak, for the legislation here. You are correct. It is not yet enacted. Typically, in our legislative process, you would have some nomenclature process, which this has gone through at this point. But, there's sort of two primary paths. Right now, we have legislation. They're independent individual bills. They would need to each progress. Well, one would need to progress through one house of Congress and then go all the way around back through the other house of Congress in order to be approved, passed by the president, et cetera. So that's, a multi-month process. As many of you know, legislation in the United States is a little bit stymied right now, that the, sort of bipartisan or partisanship, partisan rancor, so to speak, is really creating a lot of obstacles for these individual pieces of legislation. And what we're seeing being passed through Congress are these sort of big appropriations bills that, are necessary for things like defense funding. We just saw that go through recently. So there is an expectation that this BIOSECURE Act may find its way into what's called the National Defense Appropriations Act, which is a big appropriations bill that is just now getting kicked off here in Washington, D.C., and is the annual funding bill for the military. It's considered a, quote, must-pass bill. It's been passed for each year for the last 63 years. And so we would expect that, that should be finalized by the end of the year. If the BIOSECURE Act finds its way into that legislation, then we're looking at perhaps a end of year time frame, sort of October through December being the date when we would, have a final version of that in place. However, it's likely we'll see some additional iterations of that legislation over the summer when a lot of work is done on that appropriations bill.
So thanks, Matt. I mean, I think from our perspective, this means we've got to keep it as a watching brief. That which is being briefed out now may not be what appears at the end of the process, and these things can be amended. Obviously, in the UK, we're conscious that you've got a presidential election before the end of the year. But am I right in thinking that even if whoever's the president between the election and the inauguration, the outgoing president, President Biden, or even if he gets another term, would have the opportunity to sign this in that period of time between October and the inauguration of the next president, or him again if it's him next time around?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Steve. So this piece of legislation has bipartisan support. Both Democrats and Republicans have voiced their sponsorship of both versions of the legislation, and so we would expect that. Given the sort of rhetoric that we hear writ large around relationships with China right now in the United States, and then given, like you say, the political climate where good sound bites really go a long way in 2024 and beyond, that we would expect to see either President Biden sign this at the end of the year, or if this were to cross a President Trump desk, that is likely to be signed as well. Certainly, our goal here is not to, raise unnecessary concern or unnecessary, flags for people that might sound alarmist in nature. Rather, I think, Steve, the way you described it is appropriate, that this is something that is potentially looming on the horizon, and that we would suggest that companies pay close attention to, be ready to make any adjustments as needed to business plans. But at this stage, it remains early in the proposed legislative process.
Thanks. I think that's clear. So I suppose the next thing we should talk about is what actually are the proposals, because they're not about everything to do with China. They're about some fairly specific things. What are the actual nuts and bolts of this?
Yeah, great question. So really what the legislation, both in the House and the Senate, is concerned with are relationships with Chinese entities, in particular, WuXi AppTec, BGI, MGI, and Complete Genomics. So these are entities that are named specifically in the legislation, that the drafters in Congress have certainly, made clear through letters and other public statements, their reasoning behind focusing on these companies. And the law itself is designed to say that the U.S. government won't spend its funds on what they call biotechnology equipment or services that are produced or provided by one of these entities. And so why does that matter for biotech companies? Well, certainly, I think, as Richard noted already, that there's a lot of relationships with WuXi AppTec and others that are based on really high quality service and, good long-standing outcomes and positive relationships that have really, built up over time. And to the extent that a company has engaged with one of these entities to provide these services, it could find itself in a difficult position when it goes to get, for example, a U.S. government contract, a U.S. government loan, or a government grant. Now, why is that important? Well, there's a couple of key government contracts that a pharmaceutical company needs to have in place in order to receive government reimbursement in the United States. So the Veterans Affairs Federal Supply Schedule contracts, certain Medicare and Medicaid contracts, and the like. In addition, there's a substantial number of key research grants that are available in the United States from NIH, BARDA, and others that potentially could be implicated to the extent that a company that's seeking a contract or grant or loan is working with, for example, WuXi to deliver services under that contract. So that's really, where the BioSecure Act comes into play, is the government contracting with or providing a loan or grant to an entity that's, using equipment or services from one of these entities. Certainly there's, more nuance to it than that, but I think sort of writ large, that's sort of in a nutshell, what the legislation is trying to get at.
Yeah, and Matt, I think that was the key thing that I understood. And I know, Richard, if you want to comment at this point, but basically everybody who's producing product, biotech drugs globally, the US market's a vitally important market. And if this has the implication downstream to mean how you made your product means you can't sell into the US market because you can't get some of those key US federal contracts, even if you're not reliant on US federal money for your research, the value of your product, if it's going to be sold to a global company that hopes to market it in the States, they are going to care about it. So that's why I think we particularly are flagging this at this stage, if I've got that right. Is that your thinking too, Richard?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are a UK-US company, so we have operations and subsidiaries in the United States. We do not currently have any direct contracts with the US government, but that is likely to change. There are all sorts of reasons why, in terms of research contracts and so on. So this makes it very front of mind for us. Even though I think we have a well-diversified supplier base. The way the BioSecure Act seems to be going is that if you did have a relationship in place with one of the named entities, it would make that contracting very difficult. And these are our operating countries, and therefore these are our primary places of operation. So we really have to be very attuned to making sure that nothing gets in the way of how we work in the United States and also the UK.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite a big change from my perspective, because I've always thought about us, building a global biotech community, building within a global context. And I look around and I look at WuXi and I can see them with spades in the ground in sites in the USA and a couple of key areas. I know they've made some investment plans in Ireland, just to the west of us. We know that they've bought assets in the UK and own and operate a European business. Does it mean, Matt, that that all of those things will not be considered? Will they be part of it, or are they considered part of WuXi?
Yeah, it's a great question. The way the law, or the legislation, I should say, is currently drafted is intended to be, quite broad. And so it's designed to capture any subsidiaries, affiliates, parents, successors, kind of anybody in the corporate umbrella in connection with one of the named entities. And so presumably, there could be a touch point there. Of course, one of the things that we're really waiting for here in DC is to see what additional detail and clarification will come out in future iterations of the legislation. Certainly, the lobbyists and government affairs professionals who are representing the biotech industry here in DC are focused on ensuring that practical consequences are taken into account, and the avoidance of disruption is taken into account to the extent that this legislation passes. And part of that is because it's intended to have this broad reach that could potentially cover those, EU subsidiaries and affiliates elsewhere.
No, thanks. I think that's really important point. You touched on some of the process and the lobbying efforts in DC. I think, maybe a bit inside baseball. I'm fascinated by this in part because it's the world I live in London and Westminster. But I think it is interesting to see how that's playing out. We've seen some pretty bold moves from Bio. Maybe you could just talk through how that's played out.
Yeah, certainly. So there was a bit of a wave that passed through the biotech industry maybe a month or so ago with a statement that had been released by Bio about its support for the BIOSECURE Act. And I think in part, that was the result of really some practical considerations. I don't have any insider view of this, so this is my just clarification. Yeah. This is my own speculation here. But that, Congress has been very active in its vocalization around relationships with these entities, a letter to the Government Accountability Office about NIH grants, a letter to DOD about the so-called 1260H list, et cetera. And so one of those, letter to DOJ and others about, some of the national security risks that they allege are posed here. And one of those notices was this letter to Bio indicating that they could be viewed as an unregistered agent of a foreign adversary given the relationship with WuXi. And so certainly I think that put the industry in a really difficult spot here in Washington, especially as folks who are well educated and knowledgeable about the practical implications of this law on the industry, while they're in the room trying to make some practical adjustments and give some advice and guidance about how the implications of this law could be consequential. If there's an accusation that somebody's an unregistered agent of a foreign adversary, they're probably not going to get in the room. So I think that part of that was really just to ensure a seat at the table. But again, my own personal speculation.
No, I think it's really useful context. I think, as you say, the job of a trade association is to ensure that the views of the members are heard by the appropriate places where they need to be heard. It's vital that communication continues, and if you're putting in an invidious position, it can be very difficult. I think that's probably where Bio got to. I was interested to see that the sort of process there was that there was a conscious decoupling, or whatever that Gwyneth Paltrow process is that they do, but WuXi are no longer members of Bio, and that seems to have enabled, I hope, John Crowley and the Bio team to be as effective in your city as I hope we are in London and Westminster. To say from a UK perspective, we're not in a similar position. We continue to maintain good relationships with all parties and are keen to do so. Richard, do you have a perspective on this? It does seem it's an unusual one, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I don't have any specialist knowledge of this. It is an interesting thing that I guess even in the UK we we should make sure the UK government, if it was to go down any of this kind of similar path, has a good understanding of the facts, a good and accurate and objective understanding of the ground truth of how UK companies work with overseas CROs, including the ones we're talking about. But it probably is also, very important to remember that in some countries, there's a blurring between private enterprise and the state. And in potentially lobbying for the status quo, there is of course a danger that one is basically lobbying effectively, on behalf of another state or another country. And I think that is a very dangerous and difficult place for any trade association or any company to get into. And obviously, our respective governments have a bigger picture to worry about, and they have access to knowledge that we don't. So I think there is going to be an element of having to trust governments in these areas. And I think lobbying could be quite dangerous in this space.
No, I agree, and it's one of the reasons why I think why we're doing this. I'm going to take some of the questions as we go along, if I can, and Richard, maybe this fits a bit in the comments you've been making now. What are some of the misconceptions about working with China that need debunking? I don't know whether Matt or Richard have got. I agree. I think that there can be. We've got to get into the specifics of the practicalities of what people are doing, where and how, rather than it's all complicated. Don't know if Richard, you got any thoughts?
I didn't quite catch the question. The sound quality is very poor.
Do you think there are misconceptions about working with China, or particularly working with Wuxi, that are coming up from some of the communities that anybody you talk to, or do you think? I just think there's a lack of understanding. Is my premise.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that has pleasantly surprised me is, I mean, I've only got experience of two companies, Wuxi Aptec and Wuxi Biologic, is the consistent excellence in the service they provide. And I guess there might have been prejudices in the past that some companies in China might not be operating at the right standards. And I think all evidence of that is not true. They are very, very good. So yeah, I mean, that is a fact. They're good. So we need to, any myths there probably, need to be done. I'm sure there are low quality CROs as well, as there are elsewhere in the world, but these two in particular. I guess I have no inside knowledge, no specialist knowledge in this tool. I guess there is always concerns about intellectual property theft and raised like that. And we see we take our intellectual property extremely seriously, and we see we don't perceive any risk in working with these couple of companies in that respect. And it's hard to see how just how it would actually happen anyway. But again, we don't necessarily as private individuals have access to all the information that our governments do. So I don't know what's causing their concerns. But yeah, I think my general view is we are dealing with some very, very high quality companies.
Okay, cool. I've got a couple of fairly specific ones here, Matt. I'm going to come to you for. It's can you clarify if Medicare, Medicaid is implicated? For example, if a company uses Wuxi to manufacture commercial drug product, would this prevent that drug from being listed on Medicare, Medicaid? Is that in scope?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is potentially. The idea here is that you've got a couple of government contracts involved to get a company product Medicare reimbursement. Number one is the Veterans Affairs Federal Supply Schedule contract. This is a sort of anchor core direct contract with the government for procurement of the pharmaceutical for the big Department of Defense, Department of VA, Public Health Service, the really big public health and military institutions here in the US. In order to obtain Medicaid reimbursement, you have to have that VA Federal Supply Schedule contract in place. And similarly, Medicare, part of Medicare also requires that as well. In addition, we have our pharmacy prescription drug benefit called Medicare Part D. Medicare Part D is implemented by a series of government contractors who enter into contracts with the federal government to implement the program. So in that instance, a pharmaceutical company could be considered a subcontractor to one of those entities. So, of course, all of this remains to be, sort of fleshed out in any kind of final version of the legislation, if any, if this goes anywhere. But certainly, if we're thinking of kind of, prudent guidance, conservative courses of action, worst case scenarios, for lack of a better expression, we would, want to assume that Medicare and Medicaid would be implicated here.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's one of those things. It's a bit like saying, can you sell into the UK without selling to the NHS? And the answer is, in the UK, technically you can, but the size of the market that you're going to have for any of that is is low single digit value compared to the rest of it. And in a sense, I think that's the point that you're making, that you actually you need this for the US market, and if you're going to be there. Another question on the detail. If we use WuXi CRO services to develop a preclinical drug candidate, e.g. to run a biomarker study, then we later wanted to license that asset to a US company, would that be an issue?
Yeah, these are really great questions. And I just want to quickly say, I've been doing a lot of teach-ins and strategic sessions with biotech companies, and folks are thinking about these very same questions. So I'm glad to see these are being asked. I would say that, the way you want to analyze this is you've got to think about a couple of things. You can think about it from sort of two directions, right? First, you want to ask, are you dealing with a biotech company of concern, WuXi, BGI, MGI, or Complete Genomics? Here it sounds like we are. Second, are you obtaining, biotechnology equipment and services, very broadly defined term, from one of those entities? And then third, if you are you using that to deliver services or perform on a government contract, grant, or loan? And so if you don't have a government contract, grant, or loan in the mix, then presumably the BIOSECURE Act won't apply directly. There could be some potential downstream implications. But we'd look at each of these instances sort of case by case. What I would suggest is that for any company that has any kind of relationship with one of the named entities in the BIOSECURE Act, that you're taking stock of the relationships, you're understanding sort of the scope of services being performed, and thinking about sort of what is the downstream use of any sort of data or equipment that is being provided from one of those entities. So here, whether you license the asset to a U.S. company, what you might expect is that company will ask a series of diligence questions about your relationships to understand the full scope of, support from WuXi and others, and what sort of continuing services there are. So be prepared for some of those practical implications.
Richard, have these gone through your thought process yet, or is this similar sort of stuff that you're grappling with, or are you thinking on very different lines to this?
So again, Steve, you just broke up slightly there. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I was going to say is Matt's answering the question about whether the use of WuXi CRO in preclinical work is something that you've thought about, or I think in some areas here, Matt and Richard, we're raising the issues because in a sense we don't know what the bill will become in terms of an act, and some of these detailed questions are exactly the type of questions that I imagine are probably being talked about.
And it's an interesting one, whether when the act passes, will the test be whether you have contracts in place as opposed to what has been done historically? I think it's a very interesting question. I do think if the BIOSECURE Act was to cause trouble for any company, wherever they are in the world, US or UK, that had done something, one of these named entities in the past, i.e. a drug had been developed through the use of their services, I think a lot of companies on both sides of the Atlantic will be in very deep trouble. And I think that would be a massive own goal. And, if you think about it, what is the harm if a company in the past has done some of the chemistry for your small molecule drug? I mean, I can't see any harm in the world for that. So I'd be amazed. I'm not a lawyer, but I'd be amazed if it was applied retrospectively. But let's see. But obviously, I think where we're expecting it is a kind of test at the time of contracting. Do you have active relationships? And I think that what we're concentrating on is the most likely outcome. But again, I have no specialist knowledge on that.
Thank you. Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's right. I mean, certainly, and I see this most recent question here about an allowance for sort of ongoing or current work, a grandfathering provision. The Senate version of the bill does include that. And Richard, to your point, would sort of protect, existing work, existing contracts, existing agreements. And I think a lot of the work that's going on here in Washington is trying to sort of secure that existing work, and also creating sort of avenues for, pivoting to different vendors, or, transitioning away from certain vendors if needed, in a way that's smooth and doesn't cause a lot of disruption. I mean, to Richard's point, these relationships are, really quite prevalent. The word that I receive from, about relationships with Wuxi is that the services are really terrific. It's high quality, very efficient, speedy and cost efficient, et cetera. So I think a lot of the reaction from the industry has been a little bit baffled because, they've been getting all this great service for so long, and wondering, why all of a sudden the spotlight is now being cast here. So I think those are some of the thoughts that are bubbling around Washington here.
Thank you. I'm going to keep going with some of the questions that we've got. So Julie asks, one for you, Matt. Do you think that the legislation will extend beyond the named entities to other or all China CROs, or do you think this is it?
So the legislation, in addition to naming 4 entities, gives the federal government authority to designate other entities that would be subject to the BIOSECURE Act's provisions. And here, these are entities that are subject to the control or ownership or jurisdiction of a, quote, foreign adversary that's defined in U.S. law. Here, the focus being China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And so, you have to have first, that nexus. Second, that entity would have to be engaged in some kind of research activity with the Chinese military, Communist Party, special forces, some sort of touch point from a research perspective. And then finally, the third criteria is that they need to, quote, pose a national security risk to the U.S., which is very specifically defined as this sort of, providing or exchanging what they call multi-omic information. In other words, basically any data about people. And so there is that possibility that this could be extended. Now, under the current legislation, you'll have a period of time. So, a lot of the conversations I've had, there's been sort of speculation. Well, what about this company and what about that company? What will happen is, the federal government will have a window of about 4 months to name those other entities. So we'll, sort of have notice of that. And then there'll be 6 more months after that before the prohibitions go into effect. This is all, assuming that the version of the bill that's actually moving passes. And so there will be a notice period here. So it won't be sort of overnight surprise about other entities that could be named.
Thank you. A couple of questions about data. So someone asks, will this act impose new data security requirements on third-party vendors who supply and collaborate with companies in the US and China? And similar to that, will it also affect clinical data transfers with Asian vendors or for companies who are using these service providers?
Yeah, so there's sort of 2 issues bubbling around right now. The BIOSECURE Act is about what the U.S. government will expend its funds on. So that's focused on, is the government going to enter a contract? Is the government going to give a grant or a loan to, procure some sort of, service or equipment that ultimately, finds its origin from one of these biotechnology companies of concern? There's also, in parallel, an executive order and some follow-up proposed regulations from the Department of Justice about the exchange of data from U.S. companies and U.S. entities to individuals and entities that are, located in one of these foreign adversaries. There, the definition of foreign adversary extended to include Cuba, Venezuela, and a little bit broader than the BIOSECURE definition. So they're really 2 different topics. So BIOSECURE is not necessarily going to impose data exchange requirements or limitations in its current form. Certainly we could find a modified iteration passing through Congress here. And then you've got this sort of second, executive order and set of regulations that could impose some of these additional restrictions on the type of data that can be transferred.
So we got for nearly half an hour, Matt, before we started talking about the other things. We started to sell this in as the BioSecure Act, the BioSecure Bill, if you like. But I think you're right. I'm as interested and following in as much detail some of these presidential provisions on data. I'm going to probably try and put this into brackets. But if people are concerned about this, they are sort of different, but they are related, and they are, for me, they're closer to some of the discussions that we're having about GDPR, data security, how you transfer things around in general. And I don't know, Richard, whether you've got a view. Matt, I think you're right to mention it, but I'm not sure we're going to have enough time today to get into the detail of the presidential order on genomic data. Richard, is that something that's on your worry list as well?
Not really. We do not move any human data around the planet whatsoever, and if we did, that is heavily controlled and protected and follows regulations. I mean, our use of CRO, CDMOs relates to small molecule drug discovery or biologic manufacture, and there's no human data being moved around. And I think the moving of human data has ramifications beyond China, that in moving it across any border can run foul of all sorts of legislation. So it needs to be done very professionally.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think we're conscious of it. We have a good data stream. We're linked in the National Genomics Board in the UK into that discussion. And Matt, I think we're keen to be alive to both debates in the UK. But I'm going to try and focus us a little bit in this chat on the BioSecure Bill and Act, if that's okay. So.
Yes.
So what someone's asking us to speculate wildly. What's the likely outcome of this bill? Is it likely that it will lead to a forced sale, as we are hearing with TikTok? So feel free to speculate wildly if you want to, or we can say we don't know, because I don't think anybody knows at the moment. And I say I don't know because we ain't there yet. But Matt or Richard, feel free to comment or not comment on that one.
I'm not sure I'm well placed to speculate on the outcome at all. Matt, over to you.
Richard, I was gonna let you take the hot seat on that one. It's possible. I think what we're seeing here in DC is a lot of focus on relationships with China. Steve, you kind of highlighted it at the outset. We're in an election year. Obviously, geopolitical tensions are running very high right now. And so, we're seeing some, combined joint bipartisan efforts that are focused in the direction of China. And so TikTok is a great example. Could we see an instance in which that's sort of the outcome that, companies could continue to work with one of these named entities so long as there's a divestiture? Conceivably, although, my understanding is that a lot of the work is actually done in China when it comes to the CDMO work that these companies perform. And so I think that there could be some additional implications to that if there were some sort of forced divestiture that could still create disruption.
Yeah, there's a couple more which I think also fall into the please speculate wildly category. What is the procedure for adding new companies to the concern list? How quickly can a new company be added, and what is the notification process? Will there be an allowance for current ongoing work, e.g. a grandfathering provision? We've touched on that. And what possible changes to the bill can we expect to see this summer? I'm sort of in the, we've got to wait and see it a bit on this stuff. And I will come back to you, Matt, if as the year progresses. But I don't think we're in a position to give too much detail on that at the moment.
No, I don't think so. I mean, what I'm hearing here in DC is that there's a hunger for practical implications and understanding what the downstream, consequences could be here. Obviously, I see a question in here about sort of what's the potential, implication for patient costs, treatment costs. That's something that, everybody wants to avoid. That, the idea that, Americans or others would be somehow prevented from gaining access to much needed treatment and medication solely as a result of the, sort of geopolitical / contractual issues that we're seeing here. would be a real, a nightmare, frankly. And so I think there's a concerted effort to make sure that that doesn't happen. And so certainly, I would just throw it out to this group of, sort of interested stakeholders that to the extent you have an opportunity to weigh in with, representatives or lobbyists or others who are working on this in DC and share some practical potential consequences, it will be helpful for, helping to temper this.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I hear some of that conversation, particularly when I have the opportunity to talk to some of the global pharmaceutical companies that we engage with. Some of them have existing relationships. It's not just a biotech relationship; it's a manufacturing relationship with WuXi. And as you say, complex supply chains are very difficult to build, and if you disrupt them, they can be very hard to get back to scale or back to productive capacity very fast. I learned a lot of this during the development of the UK vaccine and the vaccine task force. These are not easy things to do, and I think this is probably an area where deep expertise and sensible sharing of information is important. Likewise, for people who are facing the prospect of doing human clinical trials where they are procuring small volumes of novel product. Again, if your supply for that is disrupted, that can have significant impact not only on the time frame of the trial, the potential for the patients, but also for the strategic posture of the company with its investors. So I think that's one of the reasons why we're thinking very carefully about this. I know that BIO are planning on surveying their members. I've seen trade press surveys about the implications of this. I'm interested in members' views as to whether this is something that the BIA could collate some views from. I'm certainly picking it up informally, but it may be that we'll come out a bit more formally and seek views as to what the implications of some of these things are. I know it's like asking, it's not a clear position to ask into, but it may be that I need to come to you for help, members, on this one, so that we can take a considered position to the UK authorities, as we have done with other issues of concern, like we did with Silicon Valley Bank, or around Brexit, or around as we did in COVID times. Let's go in a slightly different direction. Could there be implications to list on NASDAQ with a named company relationship? Do you think anybody wants to talk to that one? I mean, it's not formally related to, there's nothing that links this act to NASDAQ rules, I don't think, in the formal proposed legislation.
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. Not to my knowledge, what we have seen to date, there's about 35 to 45, 50 companies that have disclosures in their annual or quarterly filings to date this year about the BioSecure Act. So certainly we are seeing companies making clear, as part of their obligations as publicly traded companies, that these are risks that they're working on, and there are potential implications. So there's if you do some of the searching in the various public databases to see what's been disclosed, you'll see a variety of risk factor disclosures on the BioSecure Act, anything from sort of a short 1 or 2 sentences to a couple of paragraphs about it. But that's really, I think, the extent of it that we're seeing right now.
Richard, do you have a perspective?
I think one thing that is, it comes back to what I was saying at the beginning, irrespective of what's on the BioSecure Act, and irrespective of this issue on the Chinese named entities, certainly, public companies have to disclose, supplier risks. And we've seen, in very recent times, the danger of concentrated suppliers. So irrespective of what happens with the BioSecure Act, I think, every company, has a duty to its shareholders and to its staff, etc., to manage its supplier risk. And supplier risk is, it's we don't even expect it. Who would have expected Silicon Valley Bank to blow up like that? And that was a wake-up call, for a lot of people. So when we did our management buyout 3 years ago, one of the things we did was immediately instigate a reporting function in the company. So every month, my leadership team and I get a breakdown of all our suppliers globally and a percentage against them, and we're always looking for concentration. And are we over concentrated here? And we will deliberately place contracts elsewhere, even if we're entirely happy with the CRAs, just to avoid concentration. So I think, irrespective of this, and very, very small companies may only have a very small number of contracts. It's more difficult to be diversified, but it should still be a consideration. And when I say we track this as a company every month, and we do pull levers to adjust. You can't eliminate all risk. Yeah, you are going to have to put work somewhere, but if you've managed it. And that will mean potentially limiting how much work you put with suppliers you may really, really rate highly. You just say, I can't afford to put all my eggs in one basket. And if we all do that, because there'll be other problems. China risk this week, Silicon Valley Bank. Last year you've got Catalent and Novo, and that has potential implications on global fill and finish capacity or whatever. There'll be another one, and this has been going on forever in the industry. So I think it's a wake up call for all companies to manage supplier risk, and public companies will report against that.
Yeah, no, Richard, I think it's entirely the right. I mean, I learned a hell of a lot when I was at Genzyme, and we realised that we had a problem in one of the factories. We ended up having to move patients who were reliant on a product that we no longer produce to a rival firm's product, with all the inherent difficulty that had for them, and then the business, sort of second order. But it does become these things, and when you're going fast and hard to do things as cost effectively as you can with quality, it can be, I think we do get caught up on going fast and hard, and perhaps keeping that peripheral vision as to what the risks of this are important for us as a sector, accepting that you can only manage risk, and you can't put everything everywhere. So the question here about the UK and the EU, is anything known, really, any plans to head in the same direction as the US in terms of restrictions or interactions with China? Well, I'll take this one in the first instance. It's my job to sort of keep an eye on this. I followed closely a speech by the Deputy Prime Minister, Oliver Dowden, on, if you like, UK national security thinking last Thursday. No specific mention of biotech or life sciences, but I think we have seen in Parliament talk about both hostile actor threat in terms of IP theft and tech. I think it's one that we'll keep under close review. There isn't a equivalent BioSecure Act on the roster in the UK Parliament. There's nothing formal. There is existing legislation which could be enacted by the government in a national security environment, but at the moment there's nothing formal. But I think it's important that we see that Deputy Prime Minister is making speeches that's very that is similar to this, that looks at and mentions China in them. But I don't think there's anything as specific or as pointed as we're seeing in the US provision. And of course, in the EU, we have seen the development of some thinking which is really post-pandemic around critical supply and EU critical supply. And only today there was a big announcement from Brussels about a new group that's looking at medicine supply there. Fortunately, Europa Bio are part of the network of people who are engaged in that, as are some other UK entities. We're obviously members of Europa Bio, so we're keeping an eye on it there. And I think the pandemic, as Salman's question suggests, is changing thinking about security of supply in many parts of the world, particularly for critical infrastructure and raw materials. I think I'm slightly disentangling that from the specific discussion in the BioSecure Act. They are interrelated, but they are not the same thing. The BioSecure Act is very specific. The proposals are around particular name states and particular companies and particular federal action. So let's keep our feet on the ground there. I think thinking about security of supply is something that the pandemic provoked on lots of elements, and then other geoshocks, whether it be climate change, whether it be disruption in the shipping lanes due to drone activity. All of those things are leading to new thinking in this space. But I don't think at the moment we should conflate the two. I think we should be very specific about this and watch this particular piece, be aware of security of supply in general, and then manage both as a risk through this period. Matt, you were nodding, looked like you had thoughts to come in.
Yeah, no, I mean, Steve, I think you're really articulating all the concerns really well. And and Richard, your comment before about suppliers, I can't help but think as somebody who, works with biotechs and others on their enterprise risk management, that this is just a case study in managing a very specific and long time risk that, the industry has always had. The idea that we've got vendors and suppliers and the need for redundancy and for backup in the event that there's some unexpected, shift in legislation that creates a difficulty in delivering on those services. So I think all of these are such pertinent points. I would also, though, encourage folks to, not necessarily, engage in sort of a knee-jerk reaction either, that this is a really significant and serious issue that requires, very conscientious and planful thinking around strategy and, implications here. So all of this is, certainly resonating with the conversations I've had with other companies.
Thank you. I think we're almost at the end of the questions that we've got, so I'm going to suggest we move to conclude. I think from my perspective, it's thanks to both of you for your insight, your expertise, and it's been a really useful conversation. I hope members have found it useful and has guided them through some of the thinking that's going on. I think from a BIA perspective, it's sort of a few things. We're going to continue to monitor this because it's going to move and change as it goes through the various houses in the US. We're going to engage with members about how they're approaching this and bring our expertise and our collective insight to the UK authorities if they want it, as they have done in the past. So I think we may need to call on expertise from the community to do it. And then I think, as always, a problem shared is a problem halved, and we'll continue this discussion, particularly at Life Science Leaders Conference for CEOs and others, and we'll take other appropriate opportunities to make sure us as a community have thought about it. And I always think it's easiest if you've talked to other people about it. With that, final comments. Richard, anything final from you to conclude?
No, I mean, I think we take it very seriously. We know where our home markets, the UK and the US. We cannot ignore this. I think as a company, I'm very pleased that we focused on supply diversification a long time ago, and we'll just have to see how this plays out with respect to these particular name entities and the BioSecure Act. But I do implore everybody to look at supply diversification as a key risk in your company.
Thanks, Richard. Matt?
Now, I would just emphasize what Richard said. I think this is it's a critical issue, and we'll all keep our eyes focused on it and look forward to continuing the discussion.
With that, thank you for your time, your attention. Particular thanks to Richard and Matt and Chloe and Sam for keeping us all up to speed and technically savvy. I hope you found this useful and informative. Any feedback really welcomed, and if there's anything you want me to do from the BIA perspective, happy to take comment and thoughts from members. Thanks once again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.